broader property, housing, and inheritance. This is very important legal change that's needed to secure women's livelihoods in crises related to environmental stress and natural disasters. Limited access to these assets, restricted by tradition and at times formal laws, denies women their rights, deepens their poverty, and makes them more vulnerable in times of crisis. They become susceptible to social ills, economic dependency, and have a limited say in household decision making. Legislative change to this end was achieved in Kyrgyzstan, for example, over the last 3 years, whereby they identified 8 amendments in a law about land inheritance that were kind of accidentally discriminatory. They weren't intentional, but Kyrgyzstan had changed from a post-Soviet Union satellite state to an independent state where it had private ownership. And they maintained some of the legal inheritance laws of lands. For example, you could only give your land to one heir, one son or daughter. And in effect, that meant that it typically went to the son, and the daughter didn't get anything. But that was a legal provision, that they could only pass on their law to one child. So through recognizing the accidental discriminatory nature of these land laws, and a lot of advocacy, a lot of hard work, a lot of training parliamentarians on educating them literally on how in the field this is really being discriminatory against women, 3 years later they changed 8 amendments in that law. There were also legal services provided to women that once the law was changed, they could apply basically to get land that previously was not granted to them, and also land in rural areas that was available by the state they were able to apply for. So this is a very complex program that helped ensure their legal rights, but as we saw with many post-disasters, simple things like women's lack of their name on a land title, if their husbands disappear or die, they are really put in a dire situation. So that kind of pressure for legal reform on land and property rights is I think, especially critical when you're dealing with climate change. And even without a natural disaster, just with environmental stress, and you have the livelihood that's needed from agricultural land, you need to have both husband and wife's name on the title of the land. Lastly, one thing that I would really push for, if we could, in this description of what our focuses are for legislation, is to push for national, regional, and local practices of disaggregating data collection and analysis by gender or by sex. There's no real way to know what's going on in the field, and there's no way to prove it to those people who are decision makers unless you have the statistics. As great as our stories are and as great as our passion is, if you don't walk into those buildings with facts, you're less likely to be listened to. Currently, there's a strong absence of accurate data. According to a study in 2005, gender statistics do not exist in 90% of developing countries. So it's a big hole there. Attention to this is needed as a support to local and regional efforts. It doesn't have to be at the national level alone. Local efforts to get data based on sex is very, very important, especially if you're going to be taking that information to the federal government, to the national level, and say, our local people, we need this, we need that, women are being neglected, etc. It's wise to have strong evidence. So in conclusion, slide 17. To move governments at all levels towards a respective gender-responsive climate change agenda will require pressure from both above and below, from within the machinery and without. And again, it takes a multifaceted approach. It requires normative change, ideas and attitudes, buy-in of the legislators, as well as strong vocal demand from constituencies. It requires an understanding that it is in the public interest to advance gender equality, that it is a central component of any social compact for the broader public good, And of course, this is not simple. It often requires a shift in personal attitudes and social norms, brought about by a myriad of long-term advocacy efforts, exposure to successful changes, and often unpredictable opportunities. Effective change in legislation also can require that the machine itself may need retooling. And this is where I think we have to think, where is the system not working? And where do we have a window to identify it and fix that? The capacity of institutions needs to be rebuilt, and in some cases built nearly from scratch to respond to women's needs, whether that be via providing incentives for systematic change versus stagnation, restructuring of data collection systems, training and skill building within institutions, or more transparent budgeting, and means of access to public information. Procedures often need to be reformed as much as attitudes. Only then can legislation and those that uphold it be held accountable. Thank you. So hopefully that's some ideas to chomp on.
We missed out on the 90% that you mentioned with regard to the segregation of data.
90% of developing states don't have their data desegregated.